solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula method. But before we start this method, let's review what we already know about solving quadratic equations. So far, we have two methods to help us solve quadratic equations. Now let's first review what a quadratic equation is. It is a degree 2 type of equation. So it's going to have a x squared somewhere in the equation. The methods that we have learned so far is number 1, the factoring method. And this actually works for any degree of polynomial. It does not have to be an x squared. It could be anything higher than degree 1. So it could be x cubed, x to the 4th, so on and so forth. And let's review how that method works. In the factoring method, we have to set the equation equal to 0. So that means we put it in standard form, which looks like this here. Ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. Then you factor completely. Then you use the principle of square roots, which says if a equals b, then the only way that equation comes out to be equal to 0 is if either your first factor is equal to 0 or your second factor is equal to 0. So after we factored completely, we set each factor equal to 0 using that principle. At this point, you should be down to linear equations, so you solve those by isolating the variable. And last but not least, we check that we have the correct number of solutions, and we check that each of those solutions work. So I have an example over here. C squared is equal to 25. Let's solve this equation by using the factoring method. Our first step is set it equal to 0. So I'm going to do that by subtracting 25 from both sides. Gives me c squared minus 25 is equal to 0. Okay, now we need to factor completely. This is a difference of squares. So we factor it into two sets of parentheses, where c times c gives me my c squared, and 5 times 5 gives me my 25. Difference of squares factors into conjugates, meaning one of them is addition, one of them is subtraction. That is factored completely, so we've finished step number 2. Step number 3, since I have something multiplied and set equal to 0, I can set each of those factors equal to 0. I have c plus 5 equal to 0, and I have c minus 5 equal to 0. Now I can solve my remaining linear or degree 1 equations by isolating the variable. On the left, I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides to cancel those out. On the right, I'm going to add 5 to cancel those out. So that gives me the answer that c is equal to negative 5 or positive 5. If it wants the solution set, then you just put those answers into braces. So that is the factoring method. Going back to our review, we've just covered the factoring method. The other method that we talked about last time was the square root method. And this works only if there is a single x squared variable. It does not work if there is an x squared plus an x variable. This x variable needs to not be there for the square root method to work. So let's review this method real quick. First thing that we need to do is we need to isolate the variable with the square on it, and we do that by performing opposite operations. Once you have your square isolated, you do your opposite operation there, and that is a square root. But if you ever force in a square root, you must also force in a positive and a negative. Because if we work the other direction, both of those squared would end up to be positive. Once you do that, you're back down to the answer. We need to check to make sure that you have the correct number of answers, as well as each of those answers work. So in this example here, it's the same example I did on my factoring method. C squared is equal to 25. I want to first isolate my variable. In this problem, I have c squared by itself, so step 1 is already done for us. Now, to get rid of that square, I am going to force in a square root on both sides. So square root on the left and square root on the right. When you do that, you must also force in both a positive or a negative. Now I can simplify what I have. On the left, the square and the square root cancels out, leaves me with c. On the right, I have both plus or minus, and the square root of 25 simplifies down to a 5. Or my solution set is both positive and negative 5 in the braces. So this is the exact same problem that I solved using my factoring method, and we got the exact same answers. They're just written in different formats. I'm going to leave the check part for you to do this on your own, but let's at least check that we have the correct number of answers. This is a degree 2 problem, and we should have 2 answers, and we do. One of them being the positive of this answer, positive 5, and one of them being the negative of this answer, negative 5. Alright, going back to our review, okay, we have talked about the factoring method, we have talked about the square root method. Now this video is going to teach you how to do the quadratic formula method. And the nice thing about the quadratic formula method is as long as it's a quadratic equation, meaning a degree 2 equation, meaning it has this x squared, and that's the highest exponent that we see on it, your quadratic formula is guaranteed to work. Alright, before I show you how the quadratic formula works, let's look at an example here. We have x squared plus 6x plus 13 is equal to 0. And let's talk about how we can solve this one. Okay? So far, we have the factoring method, and we have the square root method. So let's see which of these works on this problem. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to eliminate the square root method. And the reason that I cannot use that method here is because that method, it needs a single x squared term. It cannot have any extra x's or variables involved. So this 6x here tells me that my square root method will not work. So I have to eliminate that method. Now, let's talk about the factoring method. So my factoring method is to put it in standard form, which it is because it's in descending order and set equal to 0. So my next step is to factor it. So setting up my parentheses, I have x times x to give me x squared, and then my factors to give me 13 in the last. 13 is a prime number, so I only have one choice, 1 and 13. Now my outside gives me a 13x, and my inside gives me a 1x. There is no possible way that I can add or subtract those to give me my 6x as my middle term. So since this one does not factor, that also eliminates my factoring method. So now you see why we have the need of another method, because sometimes neither the factoring method nor the square root method works. So that's why we move on to the quadratic formula method. And again, as long as it is a quadratic or a degree 2 equation, it is guaranteed to work. So our steps for this one is we are going to put the equation in standard form. Again, that's where it's in descending order and equal to 0. So that's our step number 1. Now, if it doesn't factor like we saw in the last example, what we do is we plug it into the quadratic formula, which is listed here. Now, this is a very lengthy formula, as you can see, and it is quite difficult to remember. So, somebody has put it to a song. We know that we can always remember lyrics a lot easier if it goes to a melody. So the melody that we can go to this one here is Pop Goes the Weasel. It goes dun 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 dun. Pop goes the weasel. Alright, with this one, okay, if we sing this to Pop Goes to Weasel, it goes x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we can see that there's a method to help us remember it, and my suggestion to you is every time you have to use this formula, write it down and sing that song. That way you will automatically have this formula memorized. Now, where do these letters come from? What does the X and the B and the A and the C and all of those letters come from? Well, they come from your equation up here. Anytime we see the A, which is in front of the X squared, we plug it in for the A places. Anytime we see the B, which is in front of our single X term, we plug it in for our B places. Last but not least, wherever our constant term is, we plug it in for our C places. Now notice our variable in this problem is an X, so that's what we have this as X equals. If our variable changes, then we need to make sure to change that variable over here as well. Once we have the things plugged into our appropriate equation, all we have to do from there is simplify. Now I did leave off a step number 4 over here, which is check. You should always check your answers to make sure that they work out the way that they're supposed to. Not only make sure you have the correct number of answers to go with it. Now, since we are using the quadratic formula, it should be a quadratic or a degree 2 equation, so we should have 2 answers. Let's go back to this exact last example that we saw. X squared plus 6x plus 13 equals 0, but we are going to solve it by using the quadratic equation because that is the only method that will work so far as we know it. Now, this is where I'm going to stop this video. In the next video, this is exactly where I'm going to restart it by solving this equation using the quadratic formula. In between videos would be a good time to try and work this one on your own and see how far you can get.